Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are, and welcome to this event in the Resilience Hub on resilient cities and regions for all, enabling inclusive climate responses in the global north and south. I was meant to have my co-host, Catherine Payne, with me here, but unfortunately the COVID pingdemic has taken its toll. We'll be doing our best to compare this jointly with Kat being online and me being in the room. And I'm going to hand straight over to Kat for her introduction and welcome.
Thanks, David, and thank you very much to the Resilience Hub for inviting us to compare this session, and thanks to those joining us in person and online. David Dodman and I will be your compares for the next 90 minutes. By way of introduction, David is the Director of Human Settlements at the IIED, that's the International Institute for Environment and Development. A geographer by training, he's an expert on climate change vulnerability and resilience in urban centres. My name is Catherine Payne. I'm a Climate Resilience Manager at Sniffer and work with communities to increase climate resilience here in Scotland. Sniffer is a sustainability charity that, while based in Scotland, believes that there is so much shared learning needed between global north and global south. Our vision is of a fairer and flourishing future for all in spite of the changing climate. To achieve this vision means we need to more fully understand those things that enable and challenge climate resilience, which is why we're here today. I'd like to take a moment now to introduce today's session. City and region-based action will be integral to our success or failure at tackling climate change. People move to cities because they hold the promise of opportunity, cultural capital, and the chance to earn money. 4 billion people live in urban areas today, and this could grow by another 2.5 billion by 2050. Cities can be the best place to be in a crisis because of the concentration of resources, ideas, and vitality, but they can also be the worst, especially when there are cascading failures of infrastructure or when population density hinders rescue and recovery. Our cities today are not perfect. Indeed, they're a concentrated microcosm of the socio-economic and environmental problems that dog human society. While many locations, especially in coastal regions, may have to make tough choices about what can be protected and what cannot in the year to come, we should try to approach this challenge with positivity about what our efforts can achieve. The process of adaptation and building resilience, if designed well, can deliver transformative change and bring about a huge number of co-benefits and help to tackle other long-standing local and structural problems. Adapting our cities and regions to climate change is doomed to failure if we see it as trying to preserve them in aspect. Whether our cities become more resilient, cleaner, greener, safer, fairer, healthier, and happier places to live, or whether we muddle through, responding reactively to crisis after crisis, with the inequalities and health outcome gaps widening, depends on what we do now. Truly just resilience that maximises co-benefits will not come about by accident. We must plan it, communicate what needs to be done, and work together now to achieve it before the brunt of the climate crisis hits. It's not going to be easy. Time is short. We need to act now and get good at adaptation fast. For example, it will be difficult to mesh the rapid changes that we are seeing to the climate with the pace of placemaking. Here in Scotland, the building replacement rate is less than 1% a year. Therefore, the buildings and infrastructure that will have to face the impacts of a 1.5 degree C world or a 2.7 degree C world or higher are by and large, they're already here now. How will these buildings cope? How can we retrofit to improve resilience? Cities in the global south are growing rapidly, which makes it almost impossible to keep pace with the demand for sustainable livelihoods and resilient housing. These cities face the triple challenge of an uncertain future climate, a rapid expansion in population, and limited resources to support effective planning. How do we build cities at speed that will be resilient to an unknown future? Whether in Jakarta or Manila or Glasgow, the poorest and most marginalised populations are least responsible for climate change, but they're most likely to be exposed to its negative effects and have the least resources to respond. It's imperative that we learn the lessons from the pandemic and listen to the warnings from science now, while we have the time to respond in a planned and measured way. COVID has demonstrated that we sink or swim together, and that our society, supply chains, and indeed settlements are only as strong as the most vulnerable links. While the climate crisis is well modelled, there are known knowledge gaps. This means that we will, no doubt, be surprised by how some climate impacts will unfold. While the science will continue to advance, we can't afford to wait until it's settled before we act. We must prepare for black swan events. Therefore, when making our cities and regions resilient to climate impacts, we have to choose solutions that are robust to the worst case scenario, flexible and precautionary, and which will share the costs and benefits of adaptation fairly, leaving no community behind. Above all, this will mean providing a seat around the table for everyone and listening to all voices, especially those who have been excluded from our placemaking in the past. Although there are massive differences between cities around the world, there are lots of lessons to be learned and shared, particularly when it comes to just resilience and inclusive approaches to adaptation. Government can't adapt alone. It's essential for all of us, wherever we may be, to understand how national governments, local government, the private sector, and civil society can work in partnership to build resilience. We will all benefit from building a strong, collaborative, global community of practice of those who are dedicating their lives to tackling this challenge. For example, Sniffer are really pleased to be working closely on the project with David and the team at IIED to understand adaptation enablers and share learning globally. This project, funded by the Scottish Government, is called Traction. It started to explore adaptation competencies in Scotland, Malawi, and Mozambique. But for more information, please check out the Sniffer website. We hope that this discussion today will be the start of a meaningful collaboration that will deliver real positive change as cities and regions around the world respond to the impacts of climate change. We're delighted to be working with our partners at this event. We have a wonderful panel here with us today who have come from all around the world to join us virtually or in person to discuss city and regional approaches to climate resilience. I'd like to invite them now to take a few minutes to introduce themselves and their work. I'm going to start with those that are joining us online. So first of all, we've got Ruby Papaleras Haddad, who is the National Capital Region Coordinator for the Homeless People's Federation in the Philippines. Ruby, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yeah, good morning, good evening in the Philippines. I'm Ruby from the Homeless People's Federation. I'm the National Coordinator and the Community Leader, and we are working in 14 cities around Philippines and focusing on the informal settlers and our urban poor communities. And we are doing promoting the savings program as part of our advocacy in addressing issues of the informal communities. Thank you.
Thanks, Ruby. Could we now go to Matt, who's joining us from Manchester?
Hi, and thank you, and thank you for my introduction, and thank you for inviting me to take part in what's going to be a really important session, given what we've just heard from Kat about the real challenges facing cities and urban areas. In my day job, I work for the Environment Agency in England as a climate resilience lead, but it's in my capacity here as the co-chair of the UK Core Cities Adaptation and Resilience Working Group, a group that sits across all of the UK core cities that I'm going to be talking to. And I'm going to be hopefully giving you a feel for what does the climate resilience agenda feel like to me in my day job, and how I work with the cities and regions in the wider UK. And just responding to the kind of introduction to the session, I think increasingly we're seeing UK cities starting, maybe not there yet to focus on resilience. A large majority of our local authorities have declared a climate emergency. Extreme weather events are starting to be actually physically felt, and maybe not as severely, but the impact being felt by other cities in Europe and globally are actually becoming very visible to our citizens in the UK and our representatives. So I think this is really driving a core for the work that I and the cities are doing on climate resilience, and we are seeing leadership activities through kind of policies, plans and strategies, mayoral kind of commitments. We're seeing resilience enabling activities, governance structure being put in place, research and evidence being developed, and a number of adaptation projects. So I'm really looking forward, despite some of the challenges that we still face, to kind of contributing mine in the core cities experiences and learning from everyone else on the call and in the audience.
Thanks, Matt. Could I go now to Emma, who's in the Highlands of Scotland?
Morning. It really is wonderful to be joining you all remotely from the Highlands of Scotland. And I'm delighted to be able to introduce you all to the fantastic initiative up here called Highland Adapts, which is a climate change adaptation initiative. And just to give you a little bit of context, the Highlands of Scotland is a massive region. It's almost the size of the country of Belgium. And we're mostly a rural population, but we do have one city, which is Inverness. And our initiative is relatively new, and it was initially formed by 8 founding partners, which were mostly public sector. And we're taking a place-based approach to our work with a deep-rooted focus on community and climate justice. And our plan is to work with our communities to develop place-based action plans that will then guide investment and future project delivery. And our governance approach is built on a model of shared power with clear channels of communication and then domains of accountability and support to facilitate this collective journey towards the meaningful transformation that's needed. And our partnership is made up of 6 different thematic teams, and we've got they include experts from across the region, from young people to planners in our local authority to community groups and communication experts. And it really is going to take a huge input from all types of people and organisations to get Highland climate ready. And this is demonstrated by the diverse membership that we have in our teams. And this partnership really kind of demonstrates that sweet spot where government, where grassroots action is meeting public sector support. And we've got a huge ambition and know that to fulfil our vision, we need to show really brave, bold leadership and a willingness to be vulnerable and to try and experiment and embrace creativity and innovation. And we're in a really wonderful, unique situation here in the Highlands, where not only do we have this Highland Adapts partnership, but we also have one of 2 Scottish Government-funded climate hubs that has a remit and resource to support communities to take climate action. And we also have the opportunity to work with Architecture and Design Scotland with one of their climate action town projects. So this combination is an amazing chance for us to showcase how we can all work together to build climate resilience in Highland. It really is an exciting time for us, and we want to epitomise leadership that empowers our whole community, leadership that is collaborative, that everybody has an equal voice, and leadership that embeds hope rather than fear, abundance rather than scarcity, but most importantly, love rather than blame. And I really look forward to joining in the discussions with everybody else this morning on this fantastic topic. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Emma. Could we go to Vedus now, please?
Thank you. My name is Vedus Sadukan. I work with IIIED South Asia. I'm leading the sustainability management team in IIIED South Asia. IIIED is actually a worldwide association of local governments, and we work with municipalities and municipal corporations to enhance sustainability. And we work on various issues, actually, starting from simple things like well, not so simple, but water management, solid waste management, sanitation, things that municipalities deal with regularly. But we also work on issues like climate resilience, climate adaptation, energy efficiency, renewable energy, urban biodiversity, urban mobility, things like that. We have different teams which work on these issues. And I work primarily on the sustainability management team. So I'm working on climate resilience, water, waste, and a few other issues as well. Primarily, the way we go about it is that we have these 5 interconnected pathways. We have a low carbon pathway, a resilient pathway, a circular development pathway, an equitable pathway. So these 5 pathways that we work on, it's basically trying to bring about a systemic change in how municipalities function. And most of our projects can be actually divided into these 5 pathways. These are rather broad and kind of cater to different aspects of sustainability. So this is what we do in IIIED with the municipalities. And so apart from projects that we have, we also try to build capacity of local governments. So we have most of our projects will have a training and capacity building component in it. We have different tools that we use. We help the municipalities to actually incorporate sustainable development aspects into their work. And we also do pilot implementations. So our intention is not to actually do large-scale construction or large-scale implementation activities, but our intention is more to enable the local governments to start taking up these actions on their own. So the pilot initiatives are mainly to showcase that successful initiatives are possible, and we expect that the municipalities would be replicating these initiatives and then taking up sustainability on a more on a sustained basis. Basically, it continues the process. So that's how we function in ICLEI. And yeah, thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel.
Thanks so much. Now that's everyone all of the speakers who are joining online. Could we go back to David and I believe James, who are in the studio in Glasgow?
Thanks, Kat. It's James Curran here, and privileged and quite emotional to be speaking from the COP26 venue, actually in the UN Blue Zone in the Resilience Hub, because this is my home city and it means so much to me to be here, having spent at least half my life thinking and trying to act on climate change. So I'm James Curran, and I'm the independent chair of Climate Ready Clyde, which is a partnership, a voluntary partnership of a wide range of stakeholders. That's the local authorities covering our area, universities, the two big universities in the city, the health boards, national public agencies, local agencies, and some private sector businesses as well, coming together to think about the adaptation needs of Glasgow City region, which is about 1/3 of Scotland, so it's a sizable area. And we've spent a couple of years now developing our thoughts about adaptation needs for this city region, gathering the evidence, doing research, doing the risk analysis, doing the economic analysis, and that adaptation strategy has just been published along with an action plan, which we're now moving rapidly towards actually implementing. But hopefully there'll be a bit more time to chat about that later on. Great to be with everyone here in the audience and everyone else online.
Thank you very much for introducing yourselves. I think now we've set the scene. Shall we go to the first question? So we've talked a lot about the theory of adaptation and effective policies for placemaking, but what helps us to go from an adaptation strategy on paper to implementing climate resilience at a city or a regional scale? Could I ask this first to James? Because I think probably the Climate Ready Clyde initiative is probably the furthest advanced of most of the resilience projects that we're talking about today.
Yeah, thanks, Kat. It's quite a big and a pretty important and very key question, that. And I'm sure many will have different approaches to it, but as you're looking to move from a strategy into implementation, I immediately think back to the very roots of that task that you've taken on. It's important to think about what region you're actually considering. To me, that region, for this approach to work, needs to have some sort of cultural identity. There needs to be a sense of common interest and common purpose amongst the people that live in that region. And I feel that the Glasgow City region has that. Glasgow City and its region has been through many trials and tribulations since a massive deindustrialization, which I remember about 40 years ago. So there is a sense of common purpose in trying to rebuild our city region. So that region, you should avoid just basing it on some arbitrary administrative zone or administrative area. Think about the cultural aspects of it. Then in setting about developing an adaptation strategy, it's really important to get buy-in at the earliest possible stage. It's really important to get co-development and co-production of the strategy. And then after that, you need to collaboratively produce a resultant or subsequent action plan. A strategy is worthless if it's just a nicely produced document sitting on a shelf. It needs to be translated into a genuine action plan. And I'm going to come back, I think, to that cultural aspect again, because depending on the culture that you're working in, how do you try and make sure that even that action plan is turned into true change in everything, infrastructure and life and lifestyles across that region? That's a tricky one. I'm an ex-regulator. I used to work for the Environment Protection Agency in Scotland, so it's perhaps my personal culture, I don't know, but my instinct is to ensure that the action plan has milestones attached, targets attached, it has monitoring and reporting built in, and ultimately, and that's the regulator coming out in me, you have an ability to intervene and call out those who aren't actually delivering what's needed for adaptation across the region. But different cultures may be very different. There may be cultures that are more involving of people, more engaging, and in that case, you might look to just have a kind of governance model that encourages, it provides advice and support, it networks across the cross-sectoral actors within the region, because it's very important always to remember that we need to squeeze out the multiple benefits from anything that is undertaken under an adaptation action plan. But perhaps the most important element is nothing will happen unless there's funding, unless there's finance. Such a crucial issue. I was looking this up last night in preparation for this event. The Adaptation Fund was set up under the Kyoto Protocol, and it spent 1 billion on adaptation over the last decade. 1 billion over a decade. The UN itself has estimated that there needs to be a spend of 250 billion per year on adaptation by 2030. Doubling to 500 billion per year by 2050. So there's a gulf between the finance we're currently mobilising and the finance needed. Even here in Glasgow City region, we've estimated that there's a funding gap currently of about £200 million a year. We need to find that funding. And it strikes me it's in the investment sector's self-interest to start mobilising that money in order to protect their own assets that they've previously invested in, to protect them from future damage under climate change. It is self-interest, it's an insurance policy. So those to me are the key elements. I don't pretend to have all the answers to how to make this happen, but at least thinking about some of those key elements will take us part way to a solution.
Do any other members of the panel who are online kind of want to contribute on their thoughts on what it takes to go from an adaptation strategy to actually implementing resilience?
Yeah, I think Shruti had indicated she had some thoughts on this question as well. So if we can go to Shruti for that.
Yes. So like I was mentioning that in IIED, we work with local governments in the South Asian region. And we've been doing this for several years now. We've been helping the municipalities to develop resilience action plans and then also implement them on ground. And so from that experience, I can actually mention a few things which I felt was quite important if we need to actually implement action plans on the ground. So I'm going to focus on the local government part because I work with them and I'm more familiar with them. So the first thing that we feel is that there is definitely a lack of understanding within the municipal staff about how they can implement climate action. The fact that climate action is integrally linked with urban development, it's linked with what municipalities do on their day-to-day in their day-to-day work. These things are missed somehow. For them, if you mention climate work, it would be something which is separate from what they are actually doing from the routine activities that they do. So getting them to understand that these things are linked, getting them to understand that you can actually do the two things together without putting more and more stress on yourselves. So that is something which is lacking, and that needs to be built in somehow within the municipalities. So I'm talking more about the South Asian ones because I've worked with them, so I know a little bit more about this region. So in IIED, what we have done is that we have developed these toolkits that we use. We train the cities, we give trainings to the cities on how to use the toolkits. And these toolkits try to help them to take up more adaptation planning, more resilience planning activities on their own without an external assistance. So it's not something very scientific or very technical, but something which is more on the planning part of it. So which they can, which the municipality officials can actually relate to, and they can take up this activity. So this is something that we have been doing. Definitely a lot of handholding is required. We still feel that municipalities, the nuances of climate change and the nuances of climate action that we are familiar with, this is not something that local governments are always familiar with, because they do not use these concepts on their day-to-day work. So that's something that needs to be kind of strengthened within the municipalities. Finances was mentioned by our last speaker also, and it's not a big thing actually. We know that there is a lack of finances. Most local governments actually do not have a separate climate head as well. This is changing slowly, thankfully, it is changing. And what we suggest to the municipalities is that if you do not have finances separately for climate action, then try to find ways of integrating these climate actions that you have identified into your municipal development programs. So that way you have your dedicated funding available already within your municipal budget that you can also utilize for climate work. So that's one way of kind of somewhat, bringing in finances without putting in extra effort. So that is one thing. The third thing which I also feel is that there is a need for integrating climate action with urban planning. This is missing. This is really, it's not, when we talk about climate resilience planning, it seems that the municipalities understand it as a separate activity, as something which needs to be done in addition to what is happening within the municipality. So they will not link that their water development work that they are doing is also related to climate change. It's also related to climate action. It can be incorporated into their climate action planning. So these are things which need to be kind of drilled into them a little bit. So that's something which is required. So we need to somehow institutionalize or normalize the climate action within the municipal processes. So that kind of helps. And monitoring was already mentioned, so I will not go into it again. So those are the main three things which I kind of feel that these need to be addressed if we actually want to go about implementing our resilience action plans on ground. Thank you.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Shruti. If I could jump in just briefly here, I think a lot of what I'm hearing is that it's very similar to the experiences that Sniffer have. We run the Adaptation Scotland programme on behalf of the Scottish Government, and we're hearing very similar messages from Scottish local authorities as well. There is a huge amount of hand-holding needed. We need this to become an action that authorities can take independently, that they're confident in taking. And there seems to be a big leap from the kind of theoretical to actually taking action. And it's I think perhaps the biggest barrier, as you said, is between the kind of climate change practitioners and the planning community, where climate change action is something that can be developed, that can contribute to development. Planners seem relatively comfortable, but where climate change practitioners are saying, but no, this development was actually not appropriate because of climate change, that seems to be where the impasse is. And I think really it's a case of not just talking about the co-benefits of adaptation action, it's also about talking about how we will concentrate and magnify risk if we allow inappropriate development. And that seems to be something that isn't really integrated into local authority or planners thinking at the moment. That seems to be sort of an unpopular message. I know Matt has also got some thoughts on this question, so if I could go to Matt next, please.
Thanks. Yes, and I think, the kind of climate change practitioner planning in space is important. But when we're talking, and James, I think, highlighted this, and Vedus shooting particularly about sort of wider kind of capacity and understanding, and that need to connect capital to investable kind of climate resilience, climate adaptation projects, particularly in an urban sense. Many of these might be nature-based, many of them might be retrofit type projects, many of them might be small, and the funding gap and hopefully money that starts to be made available is large. I mean, James mentioned 200 million just for Climate Ready Clyde kind of adaptation activities. What there appears to be and where we maybe need to focus is, we've got good projects, we've got good communities, we've potentially, hopefully, got finance coming, and there seems to be, if you imagine an hourglass, a gap in the middle where have we got enough investable projects? A single adaptation project could be quite small, several £100,000, euros, dollars, and actually, when we're talking about scale, we're going to need dozens and dozens and dozens of those in the city. And practitioner understanding of capacity and confidence, not just in the municipalities, but also in our partners and our communities where these projects will hopefully be delivered, involve them and add real benefit. And I think that's a real focus. We need to expand out that middle part of the hourglass to allow finance and other delivery support to flow into these great projects. Otherwise, sadly, the 1 billion, as opposed to the kind of 250 billion and on the 500 billion, there's always going to be a bottleneck. We can have, as I think James alluded to, the best strategies in the world, but they will stay on the shelf because we can't connect them up to projects and we can't connect to delivery on the ground. So I think where we can share learning about how we build that capacity both within municipalities and their staff, but also within delivery partners and communities is going to be really critical to kind of moving through to adaptation action on the ground.
It strikes me that what we need to do with adaptation is kind of similar to what we've seen with decarbonisation of the grid in the UK, the electricity grid. We've gone from a system where you had a small number of large generators to distributed renewable generation. And we need to see similar in terms of resilience and flood protection, moving from a small number of large resilient schemes to actually integrating resilience across our built environment and our land management. And I think we're starting to see mitigation and net zero retrofits appearing on the policy agenda in the UK, but we're not really seeing adaptation and resilience retrofitting. And it strikes me that we're not going to get a chance to retrofit our places and our buildings twice in the next 30 years. To hit every single building once is going to be a challenge. So really we need to make sure that we're joining up our retrofit programs for net zero and for resilience so that we can maximise the benefits and only need to intervene once in the existing built environment. David, have you got any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I feel, given that today's focus here in the COP is on cities, I really appreciated James's early comment about the common interest and common purpose that people in a city have, and really highlighting that cities are special, that people feel a strong regional identity and commitment. And in a lot of the global urban debates, we talk about the right to the city, that people belong in the city, that everyone who's living in a city has a right to shaping what the decisions are that are taken there, and how it then shapes and influences their own lives. So I think thinking about how we go from strategies to implementation is very much a people-centered approach to resilience in cities as well. The other thing that struck me is I remember being at COP17 in Durban, so that's about 10 years ago, and feeling that we'd finally got the local government and cities agenda on the table in the COP. And then feeling a little bit that perhaps that's plateaued and that we've not really made as much progress in seeing the centrality of action at the local government and subnational level that we might have done within the negotiations process. What I think we've begun to hear, and I think we'll hear more as we go through some of the next questions, is about things that are being done in cities and by communities, whether or not they are formally covered by the negotiations and the Framework Convention. And so that's why I think it'd be good to go into the next question around governance and leadership, how governance and leadership are put into place in cities that lead to better and more effective adaptation and that lead to resilience. So I'd like to start by asking Emma, what does good governance, leadership and collaboration look like at the city and region scale? Emma.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I've got some ideas on this one. I think there's actually probably various different stages of governance that are actually needed if we go through the whole adaptation journey of building resilience in a city or in a region. And I think the governance model and structure must be flexible and agile enough to evolve as the partnership, the projects, the place evolves. So I think there needs to be that level of openness within it. But there are some key things, key elements, and I think that shared power is for me is really, really important. And that's going to be difficult for some people, or it is difficult for some, because some people need to step into power, and they're not necessarily, that's not normal for them or commonplace. And some people actually have to give up some power. But I think that level of equality is and equality of voice and an input is actually really, really imperative. And I think we need to also acknowledge that there needs to be different roles of leadership within any work that we're doing. We do need strategic leadership. We do need structures that give clear lines of accountability and support to make sure we actually are taking action. And as I say, not only are people held accountable or teams held accountable, but also there's obvious, it becomes obvious where the support's needed. But we also need to make sure that there's peer leadership, that there's support for us. We're building a team, for example, of climate advocates that are out there in our communities. They're working at a community planning level. They might be within our NGOs in our third sector. They're also within our public sector, making sure that everybody is actually a leader in this journey, because it is going to take everybody to be involved. So I think that we really need to have diversity and support people to be leaders, and encourage people to be brave and take up space in where they work or where they live and what they do, so they can be advocating for these really, really important messages. And it is going to take us to be brave, but we need to empower everybody to do this and to have confidence to stand up and make sure their voice is heard. If we are truly to see this transformational action that we need to see, and create safe spaces for people to be leaders, and for their voices to be heard, and their ideas to be shared, I think for us, that's the sort of values that we're really working on up here in Highlands, and they're really important to us. And I think it's important that we also start to move beyond leading with just our brain, and we also lead with our heart, because I think that having an emotional connection to what we're doing and an emotional connection between each other is absolutely imperative, and it sort of makes our relationships much more authentic and makes what we're doing much more meaningful and real. So we're investing time in emotional connections, not only between our members within our partnership, but also with our approaches in our community, making sure that we're in there for the long run. We're in there developing real rapport and real connections with people and between people, facilitating these connections between other people, which then comes back to the importance, I think, of peer leadership. You know, in our partnership, we've got a huge diversity there, from young people and students to older people, to people that are in work, that are not in work, that type of thing. Really making sure that everybody feels that they've got a space within it all. So to summarise that up, I think we need to be brave, we need to be bold, we need to be leading with our heart as well, and we need to make sure that we've got a safe space for people where we can be sharing power to create authentic, meaningful relationships.
Going to hear from a very Thank you, Emma. We're going to hear from a very different context from Ruby from the Homeless People's Federation in the Philippines. James used the word co-production in his opening comments about the importance of solutions and strategies and implementation being done both by the people who are most affected, by citizens, organisations, by urban residents, along with the formal institutions of governance in cities. And so it'd be good to hear from Ruby what good governance, leadership and collaboration looks like when you're part of a very strong group of mobilised citizens who are organised around some of the critical urban issues they're facing around housing, security of tenure, access to basic services. How do you collaborate? How do you show leadership? And how are you involved in governance at the city and regional scale in ways that contribute to resilience? Ruby.
Yeah, thank you. For us, we refer good governance not only for the local authorities, but also for all the stakeholders in a particular city. So we engage with the government. We help the duty bearers utilize the funds and resources of the state more efficiently and effectively to address development problems such as climate change. So, for example, we are gathering data information because most of the time the city doesn't have data about the informal settlements. By doing this is also one way of collaborating between the government and the community to participate, to understand the better situations of the community and how they will address the issue of climate change and other issues of informalities. So part of the collaboration with others, we become co-owners of the particular initiative, such as mapping, housing development, which make it easier to achieve the goals. And we also promote some of our work, like the promotions of the savings program, which is the part of the strategy in addressing the climate change. If we don't have any information from the ground, the local government or the local authorities doesn't know how to address this issue. But by doing this or collaboration with the community, you have the appropriate solutions in the ground. So I think the leadership means getting feedback, asking for help, inviting other stakeholders to join the activities, and we have to tap some strengths and maximize each resources to achieve the goal. So I think the good governance is not only referring for the local authorities, but it's a two-way process, like we have to strengthen also the capacity of the community to participate, not just the recipient, but also an equal stakeholders of the city. So I think we already done that, the citywide mapping partly in Muntinlupa City, and it really helps in terms of the situation like the pandemic, the natural disaster. So it gives the visibility of the community in terms of where are these people, how many people are there, and then it also helps framing the interventions of the local government in addressing the issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruby. I'd actually like to ask you a follow-up question, which I think is relevant for looking at governance. Would you be able to tell us a little bit about how the Homeless People's Federation of the Philippines organizes at the most local level? You talked about the need for the capacity of communities to engage directly with municipal government. I know that you have a lot of experience in community organization. What does that community organization look like very practically? Because I think as we're sitting in somewhere like the COP, we're looking for specific things that can be supported to make a difference. So if you could tell us a little bit about that organization process that I know you've been very involved in, I think that would be a useful input to the discussions that we're having here.
Yeah, I think the way we organize ourselves is through learning exchanges and doing the saving scheme and the citywide mapping. So this is our demonstration in the ground, which we also invite local authorities to understand this kind of process. Maybe this is not a good process for them, but along the way, when we demonstrate and then address some issues through small upgrading projects, slowly the government understand how this community be part of the solutions in the city. So what we achieve now is part of our organizations. Most of our leaders are sitting in the local housing board. This is the structure within the government. The community, the civil society is given a space to be part of the structure, and then they can be heard, the voice of the informal settlers, and then they will be the bias of this representative will be part of the urban core sector. So I think the capacity building of like understanding the situation in the ground is part of how the community become more strong to lobby, to negotiate with the government. And we can only capacitate them by involving them in planning and in the decision making in terms of the development of the city. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruby. I'm going to come to Matt and James on the same question. I'll actually ask James first because he sat next to me for his comments on what good governance, leadership and collaboration actually look like at the city scale.
Okay, thanks. I'd quite like to pull that question apart, if I may, and start with leadership that to me feels like a kind of personal quality, and then I'll come on to governance and the other aspects as well. I'm a great believer in what's formally called authentic leadership, and that is a style of personal leadership that is driven by a commitment to a certain ethic and a commitment to a certain moral stance, which I think climate change and climate change adaptation certainly is. But the authentic leader is also, and this was a point made earlier, is willing to express emotion. And to me, climate change is also a deeply emotional issue. But there are lots of other aspects to the authentic leader that I think are vital in this aspect, in being very open and transparent about relationships. And that's important if you're trying to build and maintain a partnership approach. The authentic leader will surround him or herself with expertise, with experts. And again, that's really important if you're trying to handle the complexity of the issues associated with climate change. The authentic leader is willing to admit mistakes, but is also keen to learn. And we do kind of fumble our way forwards in a lot to do with climate change. At any point in time, we do not have all the answers. So we need to adopt that kind of style of leadership. And then perhaps one of the most important aspects of the authentic leader is that they consciously develop other leaders. And that's absolutely crucial, I think, when it comes to adaptation. At the governance level, this is something we've been thinking about very seriously with Sniffer's help in Climate Ready Clyde, because as I mentioned earlier, we are now transitioning from the development stage of the strategy and action plan through to full-blooded implementation, and that's a very different task. So what sort of governance do we think we need as a project, as a program, if you like, to deliver full-scale adaptation across the city region? You know, anything to do with climate change is known as a wicked problem. It's multifactorial, multi-sectoral. And wicked problems, by definition, need wicked solutions. And I think wicked solutions can only be delivered by wicked governance. So what does that mean? I would be very critical, and I know things are changing, but I'll express it this way just to make it a bit clearer. I'm very critical of the old kind of legacy institutional structures, governance structures that we currently have, which is vertical delivery models. In a local authority, you have a roads department, you have a social work department, you have a cleansing department and a parks department. That simply is not effective any longer for those kind of wicked problems that we're facing. We need much more horizontal delivery mechanisms to tackle these problems. Even though they would still be interrelated, I think a restructuring of our governance model would deliver better if we had something like a climate change mitigation authority, a climate change adaptation authority, a well-being authority, a circular economy authority, and a mobility authority. And I'm talking there about at the local level as well as at the national level. Because again, adaptation solutions are going to be very local and very community-based, and that's actually beginning to happen with climate change mitigation as well. Here in Scotland, we've done some of the big national strategic stuff in greening the grid with huge onshore and offshore wind farms. Now mitigation becomes much more personal. It's about my personal choice on moving around, using transport, my personal choice in how I heat my home. So it becomes much more local, much more community-based, much more personal. And that relates very closely to some of the other speakers' points about having to be particularly mindful of more deprived communities, those who don't have the resources to make the kind of choices that probably I could. And in Climate Ready Clyde, we've adopted this concept of the just resilience, which mimics the well-known concept of just transition on the mitigation side. And we've involved the culture and arts community to help us get our important messages across to different audiences in different ways. And I think that's a crucial aspect of governance as well. Bring in those who can help you express the needs and the demands and the plans for the future, so that people can become much more involved and genuinely co-develop and co-deliver those plans for the future. I'm going to wind up, but I'm reminded of Harry Burns, who was the Chief Medical Officer in Scotland and did fantastic research around this area. And I mentioned that Glasgow City's been through a massive upheaval because of deindustrialization and a disengagement of local communities from governance. And a lot of the communities feeling they were being done to rather than done with, having their local environment imposed upon them. And Harry Burns argues very cogently that that creates stress in a local population, in a community. And those low levels of stress create really serious social and particularly health problems. And there are areas in Glasgow where the life expectancy is 20 years less than in neighbouring areas just a few miles away. So that real deep co-development and co-delivery in a governance model is vitally important.
Thanks very much, James, and I think we'll come back more to some of those inclusion issues in a couple of minutes as well. But I'd like to ask Matt for his reflections on good governance, leadership and collaboration.
Thank you very much. And I think just reflecting on some of the approaches I'm seeing in core cities, we are seeing some differences in leadership and governance, and maybe a bit of rewiring, maybe not there yet in terms of some of the silos. And I'll probably just illustrate this with Bristol City Council's approach as a kind of a good example of this, but at a city level. So Bristol City Council has its One City climate change strategy, and this is providing its strategic direction around the climate emergency in inverted commas. And it's around this that Bristol is fitting a set of kind of almost leadership, governance arrangements and other structures and processes. And it's operating it a little bit like a civil contingencies or disaster risk reduction approach, which many will be familiar with, albeit with a much longer time horizon than the normal incident response. And Bristol is doing this to ensure.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Matt. I mean, you're a little unclear. If you wouldn't mind, I don't know if you want to move your mic a little or speak a little more. I'm sorry. We've tried.
I'll just if I speak a bit louder, is that better?
Yeah, great. Thanks.
Okay. Yes. So Bristol is operating this a bit like a civil contingencies and disaster risk recovery approach, longer term time horizon. And it's doing this to ensure a kind of a necessary multi-agency, cross-city, cross-organisational focus. And around this, and I think this is where maybe we're seeing some of the rewiring and maybe different approaches. They've set up a One City board, which in UK civil contingencies language is what they're considering almost like the gold command. It's that cross-organisation, not just city municipality grouping, providing strategic coordination on all of its climate change work. So it's almost its climate adaptation mitigation agency. They've put a number of structures beneath this with their partners to drive implementation. James mentioned about surrounding themselves with experts. So they've actually modelled on the UK's National Committee on Climate Change, set up an independent scientific advisory board to lead on certain technical and evidence-based tasks, such as a preliminary resilience risk assessment, and they're thinking about cross-organisational communications. And we're seeing this approach in similar but different in other core cities in the UK. Manchester has set this completely separate. It's Manchester Climate Change Agency to the City Council, but doing similar functions. But I just finally end on reflecting on something I think goes back to the first question around resourcing and capacity to support these structures, and particularly to support all of the other groups that are maybe not so well resourced or don't have the technical capacity that need to be involved in those conversations. So as UK core cities and other cities maybe start to learn from each other and consider their own approaches to this good governance and leadership challenge, they really need to think about how they're going to resource the things that they put in place. Because if they don't have the technical capacity, the officers aren't there. If the officers don't have the ability to support the leaders, if there's not the read through into supporting real sort of dialogue and efforts within local communities and local projects, the kind of governance and leadership layer can be a great thing to have, but it cannot actually lead to transformative resilience action on the ground. So I think as we learn from each other, we really need to think about, what sits behind these processes so that they can actually do what we need to do. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'll seamlessly hand back to Kat for reflections and moving on to our next set of questions.
That was a really, really rich discussion. Thank you very much, everybody. And I just want to pull out some of the thoughts that I've heard from listening to the speakers from around the world. I thought Ruby's input about, making sure that local government is in a position to hear from marginalised voices and gets the data from the ground, because they can't address problems that they don't understand. But equally, we need to be strengthening the capacity of our communities to participate. We do a lot of work on placemaking, and we use a tool called the Place Standard that the Scottish Government and Public Health Scotland have developed. And the standard, really, it's a way of sort of structuring discussions with local communities and getting the input of any local stakeholder, not just the usual suspects, actually making sure that marginalised communities, that voices that are not used to taking power, not comfortable with power, perhaps shy, or not in a position where historically they have felt respected and able to give their opinions. So kind of what Emma's been talking about as well, that, you know, making sure that there are real emotional connections and we get real rapport and we share power and are able to listen to anyone who has an interest in a place. One of the things that we've noticed with the Place Standard, with the Climate Lens project, is that we need to be really more mindful of deprived communities. It is not fair to preach to them about mitigation when, for example, in the UK, our poorest citizens, their carbon footprint is 1/8 of the carbon footprint of their richer neighbours. But we don't tend to take our sort of local authority placemaking and regeneration activities to wealthier communities because they're perceived as not having problems. But actually, when it comes to climate change, perhaps we need to be taking them, certainly the mitigation message, to our richest neighbourhoods, our most successful communities, because actually they're the ones where the real behaviour change is needed in terms of reaching net zero. I really like the idea from Bristol of having a kind of goal command and strategic leadership, making sure that we're surrounded by experts. And what James was saying about actually being able to develop and empower other leaders, that's not something I think that certainly in the UK our current leadership style encourages. But I think that outdated leadership styles are not going to be fit for purpose for climate change. Just sort of bringing a bit of this sort of back into the kind of the next question, just thinking really about social inclusion. We've sort of touched about that. We've touched about listening to marginalised voices. But how does locally led adaptation work in practice? We know that social inclusion is important. How do we achieve it? And how do we use inclusion to accelerate progress on adaptation? So Emma, could I turn to you first, thinking about, you know, what does locally led adaptation look like for you in the Highlands, and how are you sort of approaching social inclusion?
Thanks. Yeah, it's a tricky one, and it's even trickier for me because we're really only at the beginning of developing Highlands Adapt. So some of these ideas are more hypothetical than actually that I can share because they've been successful in practice. But I think it probably goes without saying that social inclusion is absolutely and utterly imperative for the whole entire process. For absolutely sure, and to go back to what I was saying about the real importance of developing those long-term relationships. I think that what I'd like to share with this is probably more of sharing problems than necessarily having solutions. But I worry that some of the work that we are doing is maybe gets the things going, but where's the long-termness in it? Like, what are we actually promising these people, these communities that we're working with? I'm specifically speaking about me in the Highlands. This is something that I'm really, really conscious of. Going into a community, developing an action plan, potentially even starting a climate-themed action project. But where is the support in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years time? And that's what I'm struggling with, is how authentic our relationships are. I want these to be long-term relationships. We are in this for the long term, and that I don't want citizens or communities to feel that they were part of something really exciting, and then the energy and the funding just left, or the staff or the project changed, and they didn't have they can't see the longevity in it all. And I think there's a bit of a risk of that with some of the work that we're doing. So I'm trying to think about how we build in long-term planning into what we are doing, and that these relationships are not forever, but they are for the long term, not to keep repeating the same word. So for me, that long-term support and trying to work out that is really important for me to think about how this can work in practice going forward. So that's something that I'm quite interested to hear what other people's ideas are on that. I think that the one other thought that I had to share is that I think it's really important that when we are doing our climate change work with communities, that we're looking at this holistically within that place and that space with those people, to highlight all the co-benefits, whether it's health, whether it's biodiversity, whether it's jobs in the local economy, whatever it might be, because I think that we need to be using language or an approach that people can find accessible or that means something to them, and the emphasis might be slightly different depending on the type and where we are, what community it is that we're working with, so what the emphasis might be shifting at, but coming from a place of understanding what's the most important thing, and getting across the message that taking climate action is has got so many health benefits, job benefits. It's so holistic if we do it properly, and I think that if we take that sort of wider lens approach to it all, then I think we're probably going to be a lot more successful as well, and get real buy-in from people when they see all those different co-benefits. So yeah, thanks for Kat for bringing me in there. Although I think I've got more questions than answers, because up here at the Highlands we really are at this earlier stage. But those are two of my sort of main concerns or ideas.
Thank you. Thanks, Emma. Could something that sort of strikes me there is this really sort of links to what Shruti was saying earlier about how we want to support communities, but actually ultimately long term we're all going to have to become climate change practitioners, because we're all, no matter what our field of work, no matter what our occupation, we're all going to have to navigate climate change. We're all going to have to become resilient, and we're all going to have to decarbonise. So it's a case of almost how do we not remove the support, but it's almost like watching a child learn to ride a bike, isn't it? It's knowing when you can step away and people are able to kind of propel these projects forward themselves and normalise them into their day-to-day activities and into their own kind of project objectives. I was at an event yesterday and we were very much talking about, there's a lot of kind of scientific community that were there and saying that, we always assume that we provide the data, and once the scientific data was out there, people would act. But actually it's not, is it? It's about storytelling, it's about narratives. Humans are not logical beasts. You can give us data, but if it doesn't connect with our personal situation and our communities, it's just noise, really. Matt, what are your thoughts on this about social inclusion? It strikes me that some of the projects that you're talking about have got really interesting ways of approaching this. And how is, I really like Bristol's kind of gold command approach, but how are other of the core cities looking at the locally led element of adaptation in practice?
Thanks, Kat. I think it kind of resonates with what you said about the kind of the technical element and actually leading to successful grounded adaptation projects. So a lot of the core cities and projects that they're funded to do are looking at almost, and particularly taking a nature-based solutions approach. How does this stuff perform? How does it help us adapt? How much water does it soak up? How much temperature can it help us sort of cope with in our built spaces? So we've got projects like Greater Manchester, covers Manchester City Council's Ignition project, which is looking at how to get pipelines of sites, identify which sort of benefits are coming out, attach value to them, and then go and talk to beneficiaries who might want to pay for those. We've got very practical ones like Manchester City Council's Horizon 2020 project, Grow Green, which has created a park, the West Gorton Park, that drinks water. Again, looking very much at how it performs, how it provides that stormwater management function and other benefits. Liverpool has got its Horizon 2020 Urban Green Up project, looking at retrofitting green infrastructure for resilience. London, although they're not a UK core city, is doing cost-benefit analysis on nature-based SUDs or sustainable drainage systems, and looking at how much flood damage they can avoid, and how much you lose in pension, how much health and other benefits come out. You know, 35 million of SUDs, 190 million pounds worth of flood damage is avoided, 40 million pounds worth of social and other health value. And I think this is potentially the risk of the disconnect. These are quite technical sort of discussions around performance, around payback, you know, to rightly kind of bridge that gap between kind of projects and finance and start to assemble the resources needed. And, you know, we need to think very carefully about priorities and cultures and views of the people that we think we're benefiting. So there's this assumption, I think, in certain technical and climate practitioner senses that nature-based solutions are good, green spaces are good, it all works. If you identify that value coming from, say, for example, green spaces, green parks, improving and increasing them as cool islands to deal with overheating, some sections of society are going to be much more vulnerable to extreme heat. And by definition and through good or bad design and engagement, these spaces can be inclusive or exclusive. So whilst it's really important to have a lot of technical evidence, it becomes really, really important to involve the community to think about co-design. And that does factor into a lot of these projects. But like you said, Kat, you know, these tend to be one-off, often European Union funded, quite technical with a community element. And again, a bit like Emma, you know, I sense some of these issues but don't have necessarily all the answers. We're getting lots of learning, we're getting tools, we're getting technical data. But how we get inclusive, locally led adaptation and how we get this to become the norm and how we get these sorts of projects so that they do benefit the communities that they need to. There's no point having a cool park in the middle of a city if most of the deprived and vulnerable people, either through the physical inaccessibility, its geographic location, or some other kind of barrier to them using it. You know, it's not an oasis from extreme heat for them, is it? And we've provided something that only benefits possibly a much more resilient sector of the community. So I think what we're now seeing is a real think about how we do that community engagement, but also how we take the next steps and really make this sort of learning and our adaptation projects much more inclusive. And unfortunately, I think, you know, we're at the early point in our journey on this and don't have all the answers. And I think that's possibly where we as a collective global kind of community of cities and urban areas really do have quite a lot to learn and share with each other.
Thank you, Matt. That was really helpful. And I think that's a really strong thing that I've heard at quite a few events that I've been to this week at COP26, is that, you know, we talk about these solutions that we envisage will kind of fix all these problems at a local level, but actually there's quite a lot of privilege in some of the solutions that people are suggesting. You know, for example, active travel, green space, oases, and sort of cool zones and things. That almost, it does assume, as you've said, Matt, a degree of accessibility. You know, what about those people for whom, you know, physical health conditions prevent them from accessing these spaces, or if they're designed in a way that doesn't make women feel that they can use these areas because they don't feel secure, they particularly sort of, you know, in the evenings or after dark. We need to really think about kind of intersectionality with solutions as well, to make sure that we are including everybody in our kind of race to resilience. Ruby, do you have any thoughts from your work in Manila about locally led adaptation work and practice, and the sort of acceleration that you're seeing in terms of progress by your relationship with the local authority there?
Yeah, most of the times our community is really experiencing flooding, erosions, and to reduce the risk is we also capacitate in terms of increasing the awareness of the community about climate change, not more on the science, but how we popularize to make it to make the community understand the situation. And then to reduce the risk is to put, like, one community we have is they are experiencing erosions, and then we have to do rainwater harvesting and to also develop upgrading, like putting the drainage. But most of the time they are collecting some rainwater because they are also experiencing shortage of water because of climate change. So another thing is that because they are used to the flooding, they also have the mechanism of putting a warning device system for them to be aware on when to evacuate, because communities also had a hard time relocating in a distant relocation site, and they have losing their job or economic activity if they will go far from the city. So the reason why they will not relocate, because they're also telling us that they're adapting the situation already, and they become more stronger in addressing the situation. Like they help one each other, and then they also mobilize some resources like savings, because they think if they have the financial mechanism within the community, they can easily provide some food during the disaster, and then some of the local government also will not see them as a beneficiary. Like they will also tell the government that this is the way how we do. Even we are experiencing this kind of situation, we also do the systems or mechanisms that would help the community. One thing also is that the community want also to do some houses. They want to design some houses that could resist their situation. So this is the way how the community adapt and then reduce the risk. Some of them also put some how in the household level, they also manage the solid waste to reduce the flooding, because most of the other communities just throw away all the waste, and then it becomes the problem also, and then do the cleanup drive like regularly to also strengthen their activity. Then in terms of the social inclusion, since we are all affected of the climate change, everyone should be involved, like the vulnerable groups. We should empower also women, children, and elderly. So most of the times, the local authorities do a development plans. They usually focus on one sector, but not looking in the broader sector that maybe they are not affected directly, but still they are affected on the whole situation. So that's also the way how the government should have more holistic participation, especially for the vulnerable groups of the society, to achieve the progress. Thank you.
Thanks, Ruby. And I wonder if anyone's got any thoughts on actually how do we best get vulnerable groups involved. So I know, for example, looking at the sort of placemaking and place standard work that Sniffer and Adaptation Scotland have been doing, with Public Health Scotland and the Scottish Government, the pandemic has really challenged our abilities to connect with communities. It's presented difficulties, but also some opportunities as well. So by having to sort of have a lot of our kind of community consultation events online, or perhaps in unconventional outdoors locations or at different times of the day, we're seeing a real greater diversity in who is involved. I think traditionally, if you've ever been involved in planning projects in the UK, you have a public kind of consultation event about your plans, And it's very much the sort of same suspects will come along, typically retired ex-engineers will come along as part of the sort of weekly outing to give their opinions. Actually, by having digital events or events that are perhaps much more in the community and at different times of the day, we're seeing more responses from women, from younger demographic groups as well. And particularly in the UK, a lot of local government, the leadership is an older demographic. So it's actually been really good to get the voices of teenagers and young people involved in placemaking as well. Because, you know, we say that placemaking should be done with people, not to people. Actually, the people in a community are not a homogenous group. And we need to make sure that everyone in the community gets a chance to talk. Can I go back now, I think, to David?
Yes, thanks very much, Kat. And I'd actually like just to go to Shruti as well, because I think Shruti was also going to share some thoughts on the process of social inclusion and locally led adaptation. So if you're still there, Shruti, and would like to share some thoughts there, please do come in now.
Thank you, David. I actually just wanted to mention that, you know, the issue is not really that governments do not want to be socially inclusive. They do understand the need for social inclusion. They understand that it is important, and it's important to get people to talk to each other. It's important to collaborate, and it's important to cooperate. But the problem is that because our traditional government systems do not actually allow for these kind of consultations. So they've never done it before. So this is something that is very new to them, and this is something that they will need to start developing systems to be able to do it consistently, to be able to do it properly, engaging everybody. It's not something that they are equipped to do. So that's something which needs to be addressed, really. So it helps to have a platform which they can create. It may not be a formal platform. It could be a very informal ad hoc society or something which they can create, like a stakeholder group or some kind of a platform where community representatives can actually come in and talk to them about different issues. But this consultation actually needs to be done by the local governments. They have to be aware that they need to do this thing. Otherwise, it does not help. Otherwise, having the platform is not enough. It's their responsibility to actually get people to come to that platform and talk. It helps if you have somebody who is very active, some NGO or even an individual like a champion. It really helps if you have these kind of people within the city and within your communities. And adaptation has always been community-led, because the impacts are always felt first within the community, and people will start adapting because people need to survive. So it's not something which is which communities are not doing on their own. But to be able to scale up or to scale out this process, I think it needs a bit of institutionalization. It needs that the local governments need to be able to do this process consciously. They should be able to do this as part of their work, that this is something that they need to do if they want to progress to your project development and implementation of project. It helps also to monitor the progress of any kind of development activities that the city is taking up. So if you have a strong community group within your city, it really helps to monitor the progress. It helps to give inputs, like if there are technically, there will obviously be technically sound people within your community who could actually provide inputs to your projects. So these kind of things, it helps to have a structure within the municipality. There is also the problem of, it's two ways. So the municipality needs to reach out, but it's also that the communities need to be aware. So you need to have information that is provided to the community in a way that they understand it. So when you're reaching out to people who say are the urban poor, they will not be able to understand things like climate change, climate adaptation. It's not, they don't want to listen to that. They need to see that their problems are solved. So the way you present your argument is also very important, whether your information that you're providing them is actually understandable and they can relate to the issue or not. That is something very important. I think we would be running out of time, so I will stop over here. Thank you, David, for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Shruti, and thanks to all of our panelists. I think we've had a very diverse range of voices and experiences, but also some very striking messages about what's needed to achieve resilient cities and regions for all. So in closing, I'll just try and pick out a couple of these, recognizing that I'm going to leave out many things as well. The first thing I'd like to pick out is the role of leadership. And I was really struck by James's comments about authentic leadership and the need for authentic leadership in different sorts of organizations, including voluntary networks, including local authorities, including community groups. And one of the things I think that stood out to me here is about the need for authentic leadership that includes rather than excluding. Leadership not about gathering power and responsibility, but about sharing power and responsibility and showing leadership from the heart as well as intellectual leadership. I think we had a good amount of input around expertise, recognizing that many of the challenges that we're trying to solve to make cities and regions more resilient do require technical knowledge and technical expertise, but that this can be developed in a range of different ways. I think the example from Core Cities about how cities learn from each other. I think the example from Ruby about the exchanges that take place between federations and communities in different cities. I think also the example from Ruby of how citywide mapping can produce a particular form of knowledge driven by urban residents, which can then inform the types of responses that are needed. And the third thing I'd say is that resilient cities and regions for all need to have people at their centre. They need to have people working alongside nature. Matt's example of the West Gorton Community Park in Manchester, a community park that addresses flood risk, but also involves the people who are often marginalised and highly vulnerable. I think the example of rainwater harvesting from the Philippines, again, people working with rather than against nature to build resilience. Involves people who are different. Shruti just mentioned the urban poor. Ruby spoke a lot about women's savings groups and how women's organisations and the particular vulnerabilities that face women in terms of achieving food security, water security, and addressing the health needs for their households. So including people with all of their different experiences. And including mechanisms to involve people. And I think that was one of Shruti's closing points. There need to be ways in which people's voices are included in a meaningful way in setting priorities for resilient cities and regions. So we are out of time. My closing thoughts are on to thank our speakers, to thank James and Matt and Emma and Ruby and Shruti. To thank Kat, my co-host at Sniffer. It's been a real pleasure working with an internationally oriented organisation, IIED, and an organisation based here in Scotland. And to thank everyone who's been listening online and who's in the room, who have been joining us in this journey, showing what needs to be done, what can be done, and how it can be done in cities to build resilient cities and regions for all. Thanks very much. Good morning, good afternoon.